The town of Ransom, Colorado Territory, smelled like wet sawdust and cold ash that October morning, and the men gathered behind the freight office had come to look at women the way they'd look at a string of green horses. Nobody called it an auction. That was the trick of it. Orrin Skull, who ran the county poor farm 2 valleys over, had a softer word. He called it a placement. Every autumn he loaded up whatever souls the county didn't want to feed through the winter and hauled them into town, and the men of Ransom came down off their claims with money in their boots and made their offers, and the law looked the other way because the law was 3 days' ride and didn't much care. 6 women stood on the plank loading dock with the wind pulling at their skirts. 6 women who had run out of every other door. The first one went quick, a slight thing with a town accent and hands that had never split kindling, and a rancher named Pell put down $4 and a promise and let her off by the elbow before she'd stopped blinking. The second went for 3. A widow with a strong back and a flat, tired face, gone to a sheep man who looked satisfied with the arithmetic of it. Elias Ward stood at the back, where the shadow of the loading dock fell, and he was not there to buy anything. He had ridden down for shells and a sack of flour and a coil of wire, and the 2 silver dollars in his coat pocket were the whole of his money in the world until the spring trapping. He kept to the edges the way he kept to everything now. 6 winters a widower had worn him down to a quiet man in a buffalo coat, all beard and weather, the kind folks nodded to and then forgot. He'd meant to load his wagon and go back up the mountain before noon. He had not meant to watch, but he watched. Because the placements went down the line, $3 and 2 and a man's word against the cold, and then Skull came to the last of them, and the laughing started before the woman had even taken a step. She was tall. That was the first thing, and the cruelest, and the thing the whole crowd had already fixed on. Taller than most of the men below her, a good head over the widow she'd stood beside, with shoulders cut wide and hands that hung at her sides like they belonged to somebody used to hard labor. Her dress had been made for a smaller woman and let out twice. You could see the seams where the cloth had been begged wider. Her hair was the color of old straw and pulled back hard off a face that had decided, a long time ago, not to ask anybody for anything. And against her hip, both arms wrapped tight around one of the woman's legs, stood a child, a girl, 5, maybe 6, swallowed up in a man's wool shirt cinched at the waist with a length of rope. She had her face pressed into the tall woman's skirt, and she would not look at the crowd, and the tall woman's big hand lay across the back of that small head like it was the only thing in the territory she'd fight for. "Now this here," Skull said, and you could hear him working to sell what he knew he couldn't. "This is Greer Maddox, strong as 2 men and twice as steady, reads, writes, never sick a day." "What's the price on the heifer?" somebody called, and the laughing rolled. Skull's smile went thin. "She comes with the young one. The girl's mother passed at the farm. Greer's been minding her since." The laughing changed pitch then. It got smaller and meaner. A woman that size was a joke. A woman that size with another mouth roped to her leg was a debt nobody in their right mind would sign for. "2 for the pair and I'd want change," a man near the front said, and the crowd loved that one. Skull dropped his asking the way a man drops a load he can't carry. He came down to $5, then 3, then he stood there in the cold wind and looked at the planks and said, very quietly, "Folks, she's a good worker. Somebody take her on." Nobody moved. Out on that dock, the tall woman lifted her chin a half-inch and stared at the mountains past the rooftops, like she could already see the road back to the poor farm, and the snow that would come, and the winter that ate children who had nobody. Elias knew that look. He had worn it himself, standing over 2 graves on a hill with a shovel he couldn't make himself set down. His hand found the coins in his pocket. They were cold and worn smooth, and they were everything he had. And a smart man, a man with any sense left in him, kept them for powder and salt and the long dark months ahead. He had come down for flour. He had 100 reasons to keep his mouth shut, and he had spent 6 years getting very good at keeping his mouth shut. The little girl turned her head, just for a second. She came out of the skirt far enough to look at the crowd that was laughing at the only person left in her life, and Elias saw her face and something in his chest that he had walled up with stone since the winter Sarah died came loose all at once. $2, he said. The whole crowd turned around. For a beat, nobody understood him. Then Skull said, "2," and stopped, because $2 was nothing. $2 was an insult. $2 was less than a man paid for a barrel of nails. $2, Elias said again, and walked forward out of the shadow, and the men parted for the size of him the way men do. The laughing tried to start back up. Somebody said the mountain man wanted a mountain wife. Somebody said he'd finally gone simple from too many winters alone, and Elias let it run off him like rain. He set the 2 silver dollars on the corner of Skull's tally box, and they made a small, flat sound, and that was the sound of the last money he had on this earth. "That meets it," Skull said, fast, before the woman could go unclaimed and unfed. "That meets it. Sold." Up close, she was even taller than she'd looked, near enough to meet his eyes, and her eyes were a steady dark brown, and they did not thank him. They measured him. They went over his coat and his hands and his face like she was reading a contract for the trick, buried in the small print, because every kindness she'd ever been handed had turned out to have a hook in it. "You bought us cheap," she said. Her voice was low and even. Folks generally do when they figure they can use a thing up. "I bought flour cheaper this morning, and I mean to bake bread with it," Elias said. "Not use it up." She held his eyes a moment longer. The child had come all the way out now and stood pressed to Greer's side, staring up at the bearded giant who'd taken them, and Elias crouched down slow, so he wasn't looming over the small one, and he didn't say anything stupid like, "Don't be scared." He just looked at her, level, one tired person to another. "What's your name?" he asked her. The girl said nothing. "She doesn't talk," Greer said, and there was a warning in it, sharp as a fence wire. "Not since her mother. You'll leave that be." "All right," Elias said. He stood. His knees cracked. Somewhere behind him a man was still chuckling about the $2, and Elias reached into his coat pocket where the coins had been and found instead the other thing he always carried, a small horse carved from a block of mountain ash, no bigger than his thumb. He had made it for a girl who never got old enough to hold it. He'd carried it 6 years and shown it to no living soul. He held it out to the child on his open palm. She looked at it. She looked at him. She didn't take it, but she didn't look away from it either, and that was something. And Elias closed his hand gentle around the little horse and stood up and turned to Greer. "Wagon's the gray one," he said. "I'd best get you both up the mountain before the weather turns." The road up to Elias Ward's claim climbed for half a day through aspen gone gold, and then through the dark pines above them, and for most of it nobody said a word. Greer rode the wagon seat with her spine straight and the child asleep against her, and she watched everything. She watched how the man handled the team, easy, never laying the whip on. She watched the country get higher and meaner and emptier, and she did the math. A woman in her position always did, which was how far it was back to anywhere, and how a person on foot might make it if she had to run. "There's no neighbors up here," she said at last. Not a question. "Gray Horse Winters in the next park over," Elias said. "Asa, Ute man, runs horses. Good as any I know. Town's a half day down. You're not as alone as it looks." "I've been alone with people all around me my whole life," Greer said. The look of it never mattered much. He didn't have an answer for that, so he gave her none, and she found she didn't mind. The men who'd hurt her had always been quick with answers. The cabin sat at the top of a long open meadow the color of straw, ringed by black timber, with a creek running cold down the middle of it and the white peaks standing over all of it like judges. It was a good place. Greer saw that right off, the way she saw soundness in a horse, in the bones of the thing. Tight corner-notched logs, a stone chimney that drew clean, a barn that a careful man had built to outlast him. But it had the feel of a place where nobody really lived anymore. Curtains Sarah had sewn, faded, gray, now. A rocking chair gone still by the cold hearth, and up on the slope behind the cabin, plain to see, 2 wooden crosses fenced off in a little square, one of them no longer than a man's forearm. Greer looked at the small cross a long while. "My wife," Elias said, following her eyes, "and our girl, Mercy. The diphtheria came through 6 winters back. I was off scouting a survey crew down on the Animas. By the time I rode up that hill they were—" He stopped. He had not said the rest of that sentence out loud in 6 years, and he did not say it now. They were 3 days gone. Greer didn't tell him she was sorry. People had told her they were sorry her whole life, and it had never once fed her or warmed her. She just nodded once, and shifted the sleeping child higher on her shoulder, and that was a truer kindness than any word, and Elias felt it land. There was a paper nailed to the cabin door. He hadn't put it there. He climbed down stiff and pulled it loose, and read it twice, while the wind worried the corner of it, and Greer watched his jaw go tight in the beard. "Trouble?" she asked. "Royce Calder," Elias said, like the name tasted bad. "Cattle and money, mostly money. He holds the note on this place. Has since the bank in Ransom sold off its paper 2 years back, and he bought up the lot of it." He folded the notice along its crease. "I've been behind. A widower up a mountain doesn't make cash, makes hides and meat and gets by. Calder's calling it. $400 by the first hard snow, or the land's his. Says here he means to enforce it." $400, Greer said. $400, Elias agreed and laughed, short and without any humor in it. "I have got, as of this morning, exactly nothing. Spent my last 2 on you." He heard how it came out and looked up quick, but Greer wasn't insulted. She was looking down the long gold meadow to where the creek ran, and there was something working behind her steady eyes, something that hadn't been there at the auction, and it took Elias a moment to understand what it was. It was interest. "Why does a man like that want a hardscrabble homestead up at 9,000 feet, she said. "Land like this won't fatten a steer. There's 3 feet of snow on it half the year. A money man doesn't chase $400 up a mountain for the love of it." "I don't know," Elias admitted. "I've wondered." "Then I'd start wondering harder," Greer said, "before I let him take it." That night she put the child to bed in the loft and came down and ate the venison Elias fried, and she did not make small talk, and neither did he, and it was the most peaceful supper either of them had sat to in years. The fire was the only sound. Boone, the old dog, lay across Elias's feet and watched the new people with his gray muzzle on his paws. When Greer rose to wash the plates, she found a small carved horse sitting on the window-sill, set there careful, where a child climbing down from the loft in the morning would be sure to see it. She turned it over in her big hand. Mountain ash, sanded smooth as a creek stone, every part of it worked with love by a man who'd had no one left to give it to. She didn't say anything about it, but she set it back exactly where she'd found it, square in the morning light, and she looked at the broad, quiet back of the man at the table a beat longer than she meant to. In the gray before dawn, the child came down the loft ladder on her own. Elias was already up, feeding the fire. He heard the small feet and made himself not turn, not stare, not do any of the things that send a wild thing bolting. He kept on with the kindling, and in the corner of his eye he saw the little girl cross the cold floor in her bare feet and reach up to the window-sill and close her hand around the carved horse and stand there a moment just holding it, Then she carried it back up the ladder with her, both arms wrapped around it, and was gone. Elias knelt by the hearth with the kindling forgotten in his hands. 6 years he'd carried that horse for a daughter who never held it. He turned his face to the fire so that Greer, coming down the ladder behind him, would not see what was on it. She saw anyway. She didn't say a word about that either. But something between the two grown people in that cabin shifted in the dark before sunup, quiet and permanent, like the first thaw cracking deep in a frozen creek where nobody can see it yet. It was the stallion that showed Elias what he'd actually bought for $2. There was a band of wild horses that ran the high parks above the timber, and at the head of it was a blue roan stud that every man in the valley had a story about, and not one had a rope on. He'd been run by cowhands and shot at by a rancher whose mares he'd stolen, and he had outlasted all of them. Elias had a half-gentled mare of his own who slipped her picket one morning in the 3rd week and went up the meadow to join the wild band, and Elias swore and pulled on his boots, because a lost saddle horse, up here, was a long walk and a hard winter. He came over the rise and stopped dead. Greer was already up there. She had walked out before light, and she was standing in the open meadow maybe 30 feet from the wild band, not moving, her back half turned to them, doing nothing at all. The blue roan stud stood between her and his mares with his head up and his nostrils wide, and every line of him said, "Run," and he did not run. He stamped, he blew, he swung his head, and Greer just stood there in the cold grass with her shoulders soft and easy, paying him no mind, humming something low under her breath that Elias couldn't make out. It took her the better part of an hour. Elias never moved from the rise. He'd have sooner cut off his hand than break it. Inch by inch the roan came down off his fear. He stretched his nose toward her. He'd snatch it back, blow, paw, and then come a half-step closer. And at the end of that hour, the meanest, freest horse in the territory stood with his muzzle in Greer Maddox's open hand, lipping at her palm, and his eye had gone soft. She caught Elias's stray mare without any fuss at all and led her back down the meadow on a loop of rope, and the wild stud watched them go and did not follow, but he did not run either. He stood there like a thing that had just been reminded of something it had forgotten. "Where?" Elias said, when he could find words. "Did you learn that?" Greer handed him the lead rope. "Poor farm had an old man worked there. Cobb. Used to wrangle for the cavalry till his hip went." She said it flat, the way she said everything. "Wasn't anybody to mind a big ugly orphan girl, so I followed him around the corrals from the time I could walk. He told me horses don't care how you look. They care how you stand inside yourself." She watched the wild band drift back up toward the timber. "He was the only thing close to kin I ever had till Wren's mother." It was the most she'd said to him at one stretch since the auction, and he understood she'd given him something, and he was careful with it. "Wren," he said. Greer's mouth tightened. She'd let the name slip, and she knew it. Her mother called her that, birdie sound she had as a baby. I don't say it where she can hear. Hurts her. "All right," Elias said. And then, because the woman beside him had just done a thing he had watched proud men fail at for 10 years, and because a notice on his door said $400 by first snow, the whole impossible shape of it came together in his head at once. "Greer," he said slowly, "the Army quarters a remount detail down at Fort Garland. They buy broke saddle stock every fall before the snow closes the passes. Good money for sound horses already gentled. Most men can't deliver gentled because most men break a horse by fighting it, and a fought horse is half ruined." He looked at the wild band and then at her. "There's 40-50 head of those mustangs running these parks, free for the taking by any fool who can catch them, and I just watched you catch the worst of them with a song and an hour." She understood him before he finished. He saw it move across her face, the calculation, the daring of it. "Catching them's not the hard part," she said. "Gentling them right takes weeks. A horse rushed is a horse you have to fix later, and there's no later if we're up against snow." How many could you have ready by first hard snow? Honest. Greer was quiet. She looked at the high parks and the wild horses and the cold blue sky, and Elias could see her counting in her head, days and animals and her own 2 hands. With help on the catching and the feed, she said, if your Ute neighbor's as good as you claim, and if Calder leaves us be. She let out a slow breath. Maybe enough. Maybe. I won't promise you a thing I can't deliver. I've had enough promises like that made to me. I'm not asking you to promise, Elias said. I'm asking you to try. She looked at him then, really looked, the contract-reading look from the auction, hunting for the hook. And she didn't find one, because there wasn't one, and Elias watched her not find it, and watched something in her brace itself against the strange feeling of being asked instead of told. All right, mountain man, she said. We try. Asa Greyhorse rode over from the next park the following morning, because Elias had ridden out at first light to fetch him, and because Greyhorse had been watching the smoke from the Ward chimney for 3 weeks, wondering when the grieving fool would come down off his hill and rejoin the living. He was a lean, long-handed man near Elias's age, with a face that gave nothing away until he decided to let it, and he sat his horse at the edge of the meadow and watched Greer work a young dun mare in a rope pen for a full quarter hour before he said one word. "Where'd he find you?" Greyhorse said finally. Not unkind, just astonished. "He bought me," Greer said, not looking up from the mare. $2. Town of Ransom. I throw in the girl for free." Greyhorse looked at Elias. Elias looked at the ground. And Asa Greyhorse, who had buried his own wife and didn't make jokes about much, started to laugh. A real laugh. The first honest sound that Meadow had heard in years, and after a second the corner of Greer's mouth went up too, just slightly, working the dun mare all the while. The 3 of them built a partnership out of that morning. Greyhorse knew the parks and where the bands watered and how to ease them down off the high benches into the natural pocket where the timber narrowed. Elias built the catch pen stout and ran the feed and rode the long miles to the fort to make the arrangement with the quartermaster. And Greer did the thing none of them could do. She took horses that had never known a human hand and day by day talked them out of their fear. Wren followed her everywhere now. The child still didn't speak, but she came out of the cabin and sat on the top rail of the pen with the carved horse in her fist and watched Greer work hour on hour, and slowly she got brave enough to come down into the pen and then to stand quiet by the rail the way Greer stood, soft inside herself, and the gentling horses came to accept the small one as part of the woman. By the 4th week there was a leggy bay colt that would let nobody touch it but Greer and the child. And when that colt put its nose against Wren's chest one cold afternoon, the girl wrapped both arms around its neck and pressed her face into its mane. And Elias, watching from the barn door, had to go inside and sit down a while. He set out plates at supper without thinking now, 3 of them. He whittled in the evenings by the fire, and one night he handed Wren a half-finished carving and his second knife, and showed her, hand over hand, how to take a curl of wood off clean. Greer watched the 2 of them bent over the work in the firelight, the huge bearded man and the silent little girl, and she felt a thing in her chest she had no name for and did not trust, because she had learned a long time ago that the things you let yourself want were the things that got taken. She got up and went out to check the horses so the 2 by the fire wouldn't see her face. There was one night, near the end of the 4th week, when she nearly ran. It was an old reflex more than a real plan. The thing had gotten too good, too soft, too much like belonging, and everything in Greer's hard-schooled gut said that good things were only the bait on somebody's trap, and you got out before the jaws came down. She lay awake in the loft with Wren breathing slow beside her and the carved horse in the child's loose fist, and she thought about how easy it would be to take the dun mare in the dark and be down the mountain by dawn, gone before the man could decide she'd cost more than $2 after all, and start collecting the difference the way men always did. She got as far as the barn, Elias was sitting in the cold barn in the dark on an upturned bucket, doing nothing at all. He'd heard her on the ladder, she realized. He'd come out ahead of her and let her find him here, in the open, where she could see he wasn't blocking the road or the door, where he was just a tired man sitting in the straw with his old dog. "Mare's yours if you want her," he said into the dark, not turning around. "I'll cut you provisions for the trip and what money I can spare, though there's little of either till the horses sell. I won't follow you, and I won't send anybody after. Scoll's paper isn't worth the ink, whatever he charged me." He was quiet a moment. "But I'd ask you to take Wren where it's warm before the snow sets in. She started talking in her sleep this week. Did you know? Little words. She says your name." Greer stood in the barn doorway with the cold at her back and did not take the mare. "Why are you out here?" she said. Her voice wasn't steady. "How'd you know I'd come?" "Because I ran too," Elias said. For about 2 years I ran in my own head every single night, planned every mile of it, somewhere folks couldn't find me to feel sorry for me." He finally turned and looked at her, and his face in the dark was plain and without any pride in it. "Staying's harder than running, Greer. Anybody can run. I'd just rather you didn't learn that the cold way I did. There's a fire inside and a girl who says your name. That's worth standing still for, I think. But it's your road." "It always was." Greer went back inside. She climbed the ladder. She lay down beside the child and did not sleep much, but she stayed, and in the morning she said nothing about the night, and neither did he. And the dun mare was still in the pen where she'd left her. It was the first time in 27 years that Greer Maddox had been handed an open door and chosen, of her own will, to stay on the inside of it. Royce Calder came up the mountain on the first day of the 5th week, and he came in a fine coat with 4 riders behind him, and he sat his good horse in the yard and looked at the busy pens and the gentled mustangs and the smoke from the chimney with an expression that curdled as he understood what he was seeing. "You've been industrious, Ward," he said. "I confess I expected to find you drunk and ready to sign." "You'll find me neither," Elias said. He stood in the barn door with a rifle he hadn't lifted, just held, easy, the way a man holds a tool. "I'll have your 400 by first snow. You can take your paper back to town." Calder's eyes went past him to Greer, who had come to stand in the mouth of the pen with the child behind her skirts, and his gaze went up the height of her, and his lip curled. "So the stories are true. You bought the giantess." He smiled like it was funny. "I'd heard. The whole valley's heard. $2, was it? A man does get sentimental, up here alone." Greer looked back at him and said nothing, and her nothing was harder than any words. Calder gathered his reins. "I'll be plain, Ward, because I respect a working man, even when he's a fool. That note will be paid by first snow or it won't, and either way this land comes to me. I have been patient. I am done being patient." He turned his horse. "Enjoy your industrious autumn." They rode out, and the trouble started 2 days later, the way Greer had known in her bones that it would. A catch-pen rail was sawn halfway through in the night, so that the first time a green horse hit it, the whole panel gave, and the gentling stock scattered up the meadow, and it took 3 days to gather them back. The quartermaster at Fort Garland received a quiet visit from a man with money, and suddenly found his autumn budget for remounts had shrunk by half. The trader in Ransom, who'd agreed to take their coal stock for cash, sent word he'd changed his mind and wouldn't say why, though he wouldn't meet Elias's eye when he said it. "He's choking us slow," Greyhorse said one evening, low, while Greer was up in the loft with the child. "Every door. He gets there first and shuts it. A man with that much reach. He doesn't want $400, Elias." He never wanted $400. "No," Elias said. He was looking at the notice which he'd kept, folded soft now from handling. "He doesn't." "Then what does a man like Calder want with a frozen meadow at 9,000 feet? Elias didn't answer because he didn't know. But the question had been sitting in him since Greer asked it the first night, a small cold stone, and he had the feeling that the man who found the answer to it would find the whole shape of the thing. The first snow came early, the way it always threatens to and rarely does. But that year it kept its threat. They had 19 head gentled and sound by the time the quartermaster's reduced order came down, and they could deliver 14 against it. And 14 head at the fort's price came to $210. $210, with the rest of their stock blocked from every buyer Calder could reach, and 400 owed, and the gray sky pressing lower on the peaks every morning. "We drive them to the fort ourselves," Greer said. "All of them, not just the Army's 14. We take the whole string down, and we sell what the Army won't take to anybody on that road who has cash and wants a sound horse. Calder can't choke every man between here and Fort Garland." "It's a 2-day drive in this weather," Gray Horse said. "Greenbroke horses, snow coming, hard." "It's the only road we've got," Greer said. So they went. Elias and Gray Horse and Greer, with 19 gentled mustangs, strung down the mountain, and Wren riding up front of Greer on the dun mare, wrapped in a blanket roll because there was nobody left to leave her with, and Greer would not be parted from her now in any case. They made the lower benches by dark the first day, and camped in the lee of a rock wall while the snow came down soft and steady, and the gentled horses bunched together for warmth. Gray Horse took the first watch. Elias sat by the small fire and did not sleep, and after a while Greer came and sat across from him with the child asleep in the bedroll behind her, and the firelight moved on her face. "You don't have to be in this," Elias said quietly. "Whatever happens at that fort, the land, Calder, all of it, you owe me nothing. $2 doesn't buy a person, whatever Scoll's paper says. I'd have told you that the first night, but I figured you wouldn't believe me yet." Greer was quiet a moment, looking into the fire. "My whole life," she said, "people have been telling me what I am. Too big, too plain, too much. A thing to laugh at, a thing to use, a thing nobody'd take for free, let alone pay for." She turned the words over slow. "And then a man pays the lowest price ever set on a human being. $2, in front of a whole town laughing at him for it, and he carries a dead child's toy in his pocket 6 years, and the first thing he does when he gets me home is set it on a windowsill for somebody else's orphan." She looked up at him. "I've spent 5 weeks waiting for the hook in you, Elias Ward. There isn't one. And I don't know what to do with a thing that has no hook in it, because I've never had one." The fire popped. The snow fell. Up in the dark, the gentled horses shifted and blew. "I'm not in this because of your $2, Greer said. "I'm in it because somewhere in the last 5 weeks it stopped being your land I was fighting for. It started being ours." She said the word like she was testing whether the ground would hold her weight. "Hers and mine and yours. I haven't had an ours since I was born. I'd as soon fight to keep it." Elias didn't reach for her. It wasn't the night for it, with the child asleep an arm's length away and the morning's hard work ahead. But he looked at her, across that little fire, and he let her see his whole bare face for the first time since Sarah, and what was on it was enough. And Greer saw it and didn't look away, and that was its own kind of vow. In the morning the wind had teeth. They came down out of the last timber onto the flats with the fort a gray smudge ahead and the snow blowing sideways now, and that was when the stampede happened, and afterward Elias was never certain it had been only the weather. 2 riders came off a side draw at a hard gallop, whooping, flapping slickers, the way you'd spook a herd on purpose if you wanted to and meant to call it an accident. The gentled horses, green yet and frightened, broke. 19 head-wheeled as one animal and ran, straight back to the way they'd come, straight up the open flat toward the broken country, every dollar of the winter running away in a wall of snow and pounding hooves. And the dun mare with Wren on her went with them, The child grabbed mane and held. Greer was already moving. She put her own horse flat out across the front of the running band the way Cobb had taught her 30 years ago, cutting the angle, not chasing but heading, screaming nothing, because you don't scream at running horses, leaning low and pushing her mount past its own fear into the gap. She came up alongside the dun with the snow ripping past and the broken ground coming fast, and she reached across the running space between them and got one big hand into the dun's headstall and the other arm around the child, and she pulled. She took Wren clear off the dun's back and across her own pommel, and she set her own horse hard onto its haunches, and the band thundered past on either side and was gone up into the snow, and Greer Maddox sat there in the storm with a 6-year-old girl crushed to her chest and her own heart going like a drum. And the child, who had not made a sound in over a year, began to sob into Greer's coat. Out loud. Great raw broken sounds, the dam of a whole silent year giving way at once. "I've got you," Greer said into her hair, rocking her right there in the saddle in the blowing snow. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. I've got you." They saved most of the horses. Elias and Gray Horse rode them down over the next 2 hours, but 4 head were lost into the broken country, and 1 mare broke her leg in a wash, and Elias had to do the hard thing with his rifle, and by the time they limped the 15 survivors into Fort Garland, the gray afternoon was nearly dark and the storm had set in for real. The quartermaster was a decent man and took his 14 at the agreed price, $210. But the road was empty in that weather, and there were no other buyers, no travelers, no ranchers, just the snow and the cold and a paper due in 2 days, and when Elias counted what they had against what they owed, they were $190 short. They had broken their bodies and their hearts and the better part of a wild horse herd, and they had come up short, and Royce Calder's deadline was the day after tomorrow. Wren slept against Greer all the way home, worn out, but her hand stayed wrapped tight in the front of Greer's coat the whole long ride, and once, half asleep, she said one word, the first word. "Greer," she said, and Greer, who had not cried in front of another living soul since she was a child herself, put her face down against the top of the girl's head so that the 2 men riding beside her in the snow wouldn't see, and let it come. Royce Calder rode up the mountain on the morning of the deadline with 6 men and the cold satisfaction of a man collecting a debt he'd engineered, and he found the 3 of them standing in the yard in front of the cabin with the child between them and the gentle survivors in the pen behind, and he knew before he asked. $210, Elias said, and laid the money out on the cut stump in the middle of the yard, where Calder could count it without dismounting. "It's what we have. We'll have the rest by spring with interest if you'll—" "No," Calder said. He didn't even look pleased anymore. He looked like a man finishing a chore. He took a folded document from his coat. "The note is $400, due today in full. You have less than half. As of this morning, this land, the cabin, the barn, the stock, and every improvement you've made come to me by the terms you signed." He let his eyes travel over the place, the meadow, the timber, the long view down the valley, and there was a hunger in it that had never once been about $400. "Be off it by sundown. Take what you can carry on the gray wagon and leave the rest. It's mine now." "Why?" Greer said. It was the first word she'd spoken, and Calder looked at her like he'd half forgotten the giantess could talk. "Why does a money man want a frozen meadow nobody can graze?" she said, slow and even, "bad enough to spend 2 years and a lot of dishonest effort starving one stubborn widower off of it. You never wanted his $400. You never tried to collect it square. You shut every door against him so he couldn't pay. A man doesn't do all that for a hillside." She took a step forward. "He does it for what's coming through the hillside." Calder's face changed just for an instant, and that instant told her she'd hit the seam of it. "The railroad," Greer said. "The Denver and Rio Grande, pushing south. There's only one grade through these mountains gentle enough to lay track, and it runs right up the bottom of this park, right along that creek. You've seen the survey. You know it before the territory knows it. Whoever owns this meadow owns the only door the railroad can come through, and they can name their price to the railroad, or the railroad pays them a fortune for the right-of-way." She looked at the man on the fine horse with open contempt. All this, the sawn rails, the choked buyers, the men who spooked our horses on the flat, all of it to steal a right-of-way off a grieving man who didn't even know what he was sitting on. For a moment, nobody moved. The snow had stopped in the night, and the sun was out, hard and bright on the white meadow, and one of Calder's riders shifted in his saddle and would not look at anybody. "Clever," Calder said softly. "It changes nothing. The note is due. The land is mine by law." He gathered his reins. "Sundown, Ward." And that was when the second rider came up the mountain road. He came alone, on a tired horse, a small spare man in a town suit with ink stains on his fingers, and a leather satchel across his chest, and he rode into the middle of that frozen tableau breathing hard, and his eyes went straight to Calder, and then dropped, the way a beaten dog's eyes drop. "Mr. Calder," the man said. "Pine." Calder's voice had gone flat and dangerous. "You're a long way from your ledgers. Go home." "No, sir," said Hollis Pine, and he was shaking, and he said it anyway. "I won't. Not this time." He turned his horse so his back was half to Calder, putting himself between the money man and the family in the yard, and he took something from the leather satchel with hands that trembled, a single yellowed paper, soft and creased like it had been folded and hidden a long time. "I've been Mr. Calder's clerk 11 years, Pine said, to Elias, not to Calder, like getting the words out fast was the only way he'd get them out at all. "I was the clerk at the Ransom Bank before he bought it. I did things I've been sick over." He swallowed. "Your wife, Mr. Ward, Mrs. Sarah Ward. The autumn before she passed, she came down to the bank. You were off with a survey crew. She brought a brooch, gold, garnet, said it had been her mother's, and she sold it to a jeweler in Pueblo through the bank for $210, and she walked it across the street, and she paid off the note on this land. The whole note, in full." His voice broke. "I wrote the receipt myself. She had me write 2 copies. She said she wanted this place free and clear so that whatever happened to her, you and the baby would always have a home that nobody could take." The yard had gone perfectly silent. Elias had stopped breathing. "And then she died that winter," Pine went on, lower, "and you came home and grieved and never knew, because she'd meant it for a surprise, meant to tell you in the spring, and the receipt sat in the bank's records. And 2 years ago, when Mr. Calder bought the bank's paper and saw what the survey said about this grade," Pine's hands shook harder, "he told me to find that record and burn it. He told me to draw up a new note showing 400 owed, with 2 forged years of missed interest, because a dead woman can't testify and a grieving man up a mountain never checks. And I did the first part. God forgive me, I burned the bank's copy." He held up the yellow paper. "But Mrs. Ward had me write 2 copies, he said, and the second one she took with her. I've lain awake 2 years wondering where a careful woman would hide a thing that precious, where her husband would find it someday without her there to point. And last week I heard there was a child up here now, a little girl, and I—" He stopped and wiped his face with the back of his ink-stained hand. "I couldn't carry it any more. I rode to Pueblo, and I found the jeweler, still in business, still had his own record of buying a garnet brooch off Sarah Ward, dated and witnessed. That's proof the sale happened. That's proof the money was paid." He held the paper out toward Elias across the snow. "And I think, sir, if you look, you'll find she left the receipt itself somewhere only her family would ever go." Elias couldn't make his legs move. It was Greer who crossed the yard and took the paper from the clerk's shaking hand, and Greer who read it, and Greer whose voice came out rough when she lifted her head. "It's a jeweler's bill of sale," she said. "Garnet brooch, $210. Sarah Ward, witnessed and dated 4 years back." She looked at Elias, and there was wonder in her face and something close to grief. She paid it, Elias. 6 years gone, and she's still— Greer stopped. She paid for this place. You never owed Calder a cent. Not 400. Not anything. He's been trying to take a home off you that's been yours, free and clear, since before she died. Elias turned without a word and walked up the slope behind the cabin to the little fenced square with the 2 crosses in it. He knelt in the snow at the larger one, and he remembered, the way grief makes you remember things too late, that Sarah had sewn herself a Bible cover that last autumn, quilted and thick, and that he had never been able to make himself open the family Bible since she died, and that it sat on the high shelf where she'd always kept it. He went inside. He took it down, and when he ran his thumb along the quilted cover, he felt the stiffness of paper sewn into the lining, where a careful, loving, dying woman had hidden it for the husband she trusted to find it someday. A folded receipt, the bank's own form, $210, note paid in full, dated and stamped and signed in Hollis Pine's own younger hand. He came back out into the sun with it, and he didn't say anything. He just held it up, and Royce Calder looked at it across the snow, and the whole rigged engine of his patience came apart in his face. "That's forged," Calder said, but there was no force in it. "That proves nothing. The word of a thief," he jerked his chin at Pine, "and a scrap of paper anyone could fake." "There's the jeweler's record in Pueblo," Greer said. "Dated, witnessed. There's the bank's stamp on the receipt. There's a clerk willing to swear in front of a federal judge to every dishonest thing you've made him do for 11 years. She folded the receipt close, careful, like it was a living thing. And there's a railroad survey, Mr. Calder, that I'd guess the territorial court would find real interesting once they start asking why a man burned a paid note and forged a new one on the exact piece of ground the Denver and Rio Grande needs to come through. You didn't just cheat one widower. I'd bet my life you've run this same play on half the small claims down this valley. And now there's a record of it and a witness to it. And you rode up here in front of all of us to put your name to the theft." Gray Horse had moved quiet to stand at Elias's shoulder, and so had 2 of Calder's own riders, who had eased their horses a few steps away from their employer, the way men do when they realize which side of a thing the law is going to land on. Calder looked around the yard and counted, the way he counted everything, and the number came up against him. He gathered his reins one last time. "This isn't—" he started. "It's done," Elias said. The first words he'd spoken since the clerk rode in. And they were quiet and final. "Get off my land, Calder. Mine and my wife's and my family's. You heard the woman. Sundown." Calder rode out. 2 of his men went with him. The other 4 did not, and one of them took off his hat to Greer as he turned his horse the other way, down toward Ransom and the federal marshal's office, with Hollis Pine riding small and spent and finally unburdened beside him to make a fuller confession than any man had asked for. It took the courts the rest of that winter to unwind everything Royce Calder had done. He'd run his scheme on 11 families up and down the valley, and the receipt from Sarah Ward's Bible was the loose thread that pulled the whole thing apart. By spring, he was bound over for trial in Denver, and his land claims were frozen, and the 11 families had their homes back, and the survivors of the Ward herd had wintered fat in the barn that a careful man had built to outlast him. But Elias Ward, kneeling in the snow that first afternoon with his dead wife's receipt in his hands, hadn't been thinking about the courts. He'd been thinking about a woman who'd sold the last thing she owned of her own mother's so that her husband and her baby would always have a home, and who'd died before she could tell him, and who had reached 6 years across the dark to put a roof over a family she never lived to meet. A woman he'd lost, who'd given him, with her last act, the very thing that let him build everything that came after. He came back down the hill to the cabin and found Greer in the doorway with Wren on her hip, the 2 of them backlit gold by the low winter sun, and that was when he understood the whole shape of it at last. The family he'd buried on that hill hadn't only been taken from him, some part of it had been waiting to be given back, He'd just had to pay $2 for it, and not know, and let it find him slow. They were married properly in Ransom that spring, in the little church with the warped floor, with Asa Greyhorse standing up for Elias and Marisol Ocampo from the boarding house standing up for Greer, and half the valley crowding in besides, the same valley that had laughed on the freight dock the autumn before. Nobody laughed now. A woman who'd faced down Royce Calder and saved a child off a running horse in a blizzard had a way of changing what a town thought was worth respecting. Greer wore a dress that fit her, made by Marisol on purpose to her real size, the first garment she'd ever owned that hadn't been begged wider from something meant for a smaller woman. She stood as tall as she was made to stand and did not bend an inch, and Elias thought she was the finest thing he had ever seen in his life, and he told her so, and she believed him, which was the part that took her longest of all. The judge signed the papers that made Wren theirs the same week. The girl was talking by then, in fits and starts, mostly to the horses and to Greer and to the big quiet man she had started, that spring, to call Pa, soft like she was trying the word on to see if it would hold. It held. The railroad did come, 2 years on, and they laid their track up the bottom of the high park along the creek, and the Denver and Rio Grande paid Elias Ward a fair and honest price for the right-of-way. More money than he'd ever imagined, the very fortune Calder had cheated and burned and forged to steal. Elias used some of it to buy the gentling operation proper standing, fences and a sound corral and grass leases up in the high parks. The rest he put by, because he'd learned what a careful woman could do with a little money set aside for the people she loved. The Blue Roan stud never did get a rope on him, but every spring he brought his band down off the high benches to the edge of the meadow and stood at the timber's edge and watched the small fierce woman work in the corral below, and Wren swore he was watching for Greer, and maybe he was. Elias kept the carved horse on the mantel after Wren got too big to sleep with it in her fist. Some evenings he'd take it down and turn it over in his hands by the fire, mountain ash worn smooth now by a child's grip instead of a grieving man's, and he'd think about the daughter who never held it, and the daughter who wore it down to satin, and the wife who paid for his whole life with her mother's brooch, and the wife who'd cost him $2 and given him everything back. 2 graves on the hill, 2 living souls at his table, a family lost and a family found, and the same carved horse passing between them, and Elias Ward, who had spent 6 years certain he had nothing left to lose, learned in the end that the cheapest thing he ever bought turned out to be the richest he ever owned. He'd paid $2. He'd have paid the whole world. He just hadn't known, that cold morning on the freight dock, that the world was exactly what was standing on it, looking back at him, waiting to be taken home.